Mr. Seahorse by Carle. Mr. and Mrs. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea. Mrs. Seahorse began to wiggle and twist, this way and that. "It is time for me to lay my eggs," she said. "Can I help?" asked Mr. Seahorse. "Oh, yes, thank you," said Mrs. Seahorse, and she laid her eggs into a pouch on Mr. Seahorse's belly. "I will take good care of our eggs," said Mr. Seahorse. "I promise." As Mr. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea, he passed right by a group of trumpet fish hidden in the patch of reeds. Let's see what these trumpet fish look like behind the reeds. There they are. Before long, Mr. Seahorse met another fish. "How are you, Mr. Stickleback?" asked Mr. Seahorse. "Delighted. I just built a nest and right away Mrs. Stickleback laid her eggs in it. I am going to take good care of those eggs until they hatch." "Keep up the good work," said Mr. Seahorse. As Mr. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea, he passed right by a lionfish that had been hidden behind a coral reef. Before long, Mr. Seahorse met another fish. "How are you, Mr. Tilapia?" asked Mr. Seahorse. Mr. Tilapia could not answer. His mouth was full of eggs. I know," said Mr. Seahorse. "Mrs. Tilapia laid her eggs, and now you are going to take good care of them until they hatch." Mr. Tilapia nodded his head, and Mr. Seahorse swam on his way. As Mr. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea, he passed right by several leaf fish hidden among the seaweed. Don't those fish kind of look like leaves? That's probably why they're called leaf fish. Before long, Mr. Seahorse met another fish. "How are you, Mr. Curtis?" asked Mr. Seahorse. "Perfectly fine," replied Mr. Curtis. "Mrs. Curtis laid her eggs, and I have stuck them on my head. I'm going to take very good care of them until they hatch." "You are doing a good job," said Mr. Seahorse, and he swam on his way. As Mr. Seahorse drifted gently through the sea, he passed right by a stonefish that had been hidden behind a rock. But before long, Mr. Seahorse had met another fish. "How are you, Mr. Pipe?" asked Mr. Seahorse. "Couldn't be better," replied Mr. Pipe. "Mrs. Pipe laid her eggs along my belly. Now I'm going to take good care of them until they hatch." "You should feel proud of yourself," said Mr. Seahorse, and swam on his way. But before long, Mr. Seahorse met another fish. "How are you, Mr. Bullhead?" asked Mr. Seahorse. "Tip-top," replied Mr. Bullhead. Mrs. Bullhead laid her eggs, and the eggs hatched. Now I am babysitting." "You are doing a fine job," said Mr. Seahorse, and he swam on his way. The time had come for the seahorse babies to be born. Mr. Seahorse wiggled and twisted, this way and that. At last, the babies tumbled from Mr. Seahorse's pouch and swam away. One baby turned around and tried to come back into the pouch. "Oh no," said Mr. Seahorse. "I do love you, but now you are ready to be on your own." The end.